How many fingers, Winston?
You two are just dumber than a bag of hammers.
You ever get that sinking feeling? You know, the one that you feel you've only heard maybe half the story? Or even a different story altogether? Hello and welcome to the Red Pill Diary. I'm Lewis, and I'll be your host. So, ready or not, let's flip the switch and shed some light on it. It was a Sunday, July morning. The hot sun rose, and the humidity with it, typical for Richmond that time of year. At 45, the disheveled and intoxicated, Scottish-born and informally educated journalist weaved his way through the streets. Although he was well known, feared by some, and hated by many, he avoided as many passerbys as possible. He was one of a dozen casualties of the Sedition Act. His crime? The publication, The Prospect Before Us. However, in a vicious form, the truth about the personal lives of Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson and the attacks on both parties exacerbated his downward spiral. His periodic tirades and blunt writings of the personal foibles of prominent figures, pointing out the potential contradictions within the political society and exposing the clay feet of the powerful and well-born who routinely expect and received deferential treatment and privilege, created many adversaries, enemies that outnumbered friends exponentially. He stumbled along, disappearing from view, only to be found floating face down in the James River later that day. A hurried coroner's inquest concluded that the famous muckraker journalist accidentally drowned while drunk in only 3 feet of water. He was buried in the church cemetery the same day. The swiftness could indicate the good citizens of Richmond's disdain and good riddance, or, as in the idiom attributed to Plutarch in the Life of Pompey, a dead man cannot bite. In other words, loose lips might sink ships, but dead men tell no tales. James Thompson Callender would be telling no more tales. It was July 17th, 1803. So here's the broad backstory. It may be like the old saying, throwing a tub to a whale, but here we go. So with this backstory, we're going to start generally 1789. 1789, why is that date important? Because that was the date of the beginning of the French Revolution. And that French Revolution had ramifications for the United States, the early fledgling country, sovereign now, apart from Britain. And during the early parts of 1790, the public sentiment was favorable towards the French. And why is that important? Because during this period of time in the decade, we saw an influx of immigration of people from France, from the Caribbean islands controlled by France, and from the Irish immigrants coming from Ireland. That is one issue that started to percolate during this decade. Although the Americans were favorable towards the French Revolution, they saw this kind of as the advance of individual liberty like it was in the United States in France. So they saw this as going to advance across nations. The newspapers printed pro-French sentiment, but this rising French sentiment in the United States put off Britain. They saw that as a negative. They started to impose tariffs on the America and trade limits on West Indies. They started to seize U.S. military supplies from ships and impress sailors. They also threatening to block all American ships bound for the French West Indies. And so Congress and the merchants and the politicians of the day were starting to ramp up, pushing for action against Britain. President Washington, trying to stay neutral and avoid a war, sent John Jay to negotiate a treaty. That treaty was signed in 1794. We really didn't get anything out of it. Although it's called Jay's Treaty, there are those that believe that it was penned by Alexander Hamilton. Now you've heard that name. He was, at the time in the Washington administration, he was the Secretary of Treasury. Most American newspaper and the general population felt the treaty made America look weak. As the French Revolution became more and more violent, tensions in America deepened and suspicions increased with the increase of French activity going on in the United States, starting to see that those clubs pop up, start pushing back against the Washington administration is not a positive thing. They were concerned that that was going to change the dynamic of this new country. So the tension started to rise between the Federalists and the Democrat Republicans. When the Reign of Terror occurred and Louis XIV was executed, that only heightened this tension. The Committee for Public Safety in France basically took over. They were one of the factions that between the two that were fighting for power. They took over, suspended the Constitution, the new one, and they basically started to reach out and target their opposition, the political opposition. During this period of time, about 10 months of 1793 to 1794, somewhere between 20 and 40,000 political opponents basically were executed. So much for liberté, égalité, and fraternité. Maximilian Robespierre and the member of this committee of public safety were doing anything but keeping the public safe. Everybody was afraid. That's why they called it the Reign of Terror, because anybody who spoke out against the French government or had anything to say that's against what they were trying to do could very well find themselves under a guillotine. Now, we got to stop and think about, because part of this process that I'm going through is, where have I heard that before? Where have we heard this type of Committee for Public Safety? If you've ever read George Orwell's book, 1984, The Ministry of Truth, and the term doublespeak. But what's some more modern version that we've seen in this country? How about the Disinformation Governance Board? Remember that? So, you ask yourself, what could go wrong? What goes wrong is that once people start to speak out against something, guess what happens? The Disinformation Governance Board, I'm going to shut that down because we've qualified that as disinformation. Just like the Reign of Terror in the Committee of Public Safety, you spoke out against the committee. Well, guess what? You must be against us. So therefore, we're going to remove you so that we don't have any obstacles. Now, why is that important? Because that's the basis for some of the stuff that's going to come up here under the Alien and Sedition Act because of these things that are going on. Now, this is a good time to stop and do what these episodes have been trying to do, or at least I'm attempting to do here for you, because it's kind of resonating for me. If you think back recently and over the last 5 or 6 years, and especially and focusing on social media, what have you seen? What have we learned? We've learned that our government has specifically targeted certain entities in social media to do what? To prevent information from being disseminated. Doesn't matter whether I think it's conspiracy theory or just hoopla or bunk, doesn't matter. The First Amendment says I have a right to speak my mind, my opinion, and the social media is the newspaper of the day, so to speak. But what has been happening? We have learned over the last 4 years, doesn't matter what side of the party you happen to be on, what happens? People get attacked for what they say because they're not in a specific group. This is very similar in behavior to what the 1790s was seeing, and the reason why they pushed for the Alien and Sedition Act, because comments were being made against the government. Well, that's kind of what's going on now. People were saying things they don't like, they don't believe is true, things they didn't want to do. And what happened? People were deplatformed. People were debanked. Things were taken away from them and not able to speak. So the society in general suffered because there wasn't freedom of speech. This is what all these episodes are about, is to making the connection between one thing in history and a current in history. Because you know what? I've said this over and over. History may not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. And so here we can see it rhyming. It's similar to that. We have a lot of immigration, a lot of fear, and a huge division between two opposing points of view. And what happened in 1790? Well, we're going to go back into that and see what's going on. So back to 1790. During this period of time, after George Washington retires and gives his farewell address, they have an election. And that election, John Adams becomes president. Alexander Hamilton is a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson is a Democrat-Republican. How did that come about? Well, do you remember they used to be in previous episodes, we talked about Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Well, the Federalists remained Federalists. The Anti-Federalists, most of them became Democrat-Republicans, and that would be under Jefferson, and the Federalists under Hamilton. Adams was the president, Jefferson was the vice president, and Hamilton was the Secretary of Treasury under Washington, whereas Thomas Jefferson was the Secretary of State under Washington. The reason it's important to understand is because the Federalists and Democrat-Republicans originated out of that split in the beginning between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. It only widened and deepened. The Federalists, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, and the Anti-Federalists, which most of them became Democrat Republicans, were Jefferson, Monroe, Madison, Burr. They were Democrat Republicans. And like today, these two factions, they called them, they eventually turned into parties. The Federalists eventually dissolved. Democrat Republicans aren't Republicans like you would think today. The religious call them Democrats. But the problem with these two factions is the Democrat Republicans, saw the Federalists and Hamilton as really wanting to trample liberty in the interest of creating this federal Goliath on the model of the British government. They kind of liked the idea of having a lifetime president, an executive. The Federalists, on the other hand, viewed Jefferson's vision and the Democrat Republicans as an agrarian nation of gentlemen farmers as a guileless fantasy. Now, one doesn't have to go more than a few days back or just look at social media, the news, pick any source and tell me that's not going on right now. You've got two very divided parties, each with their own view. They believe, rightly or wrongly, that the other one is working to destroy the proper trajectory of the country. I may believe one thing, you may believe the other. But the problem is when one person's in power or one group's in power, so what did they do in the 1790s? They started to battle it out. They battled it out for the soul and survival of America. But where would this radically opposing views, how would you get those out? How do you get to the populace? Through pamphlets and newspaper. Just like today, what are they getting it out through? Social media. So here's where the creativity occurred. Now remember, Jefferson, then Secretary of State, basically starts to discreetly finance a Philadelphia newspaper, the National Gazette, under Philip Freneau. I don't have to remember his name, but just he was the editor. And that's the person they would, under the Alien and Sedition Act, they're going to start to identify. He basically lambasted Washington for his support for British sympathies. Washington questioned Jefferson's role with this paper. He denied any role in it. Jefferson was very good at playing behind the scenes through other people. We'll see that as we go along here. Now, these newspapers were partisan, of course. Each group was feeding amounts of information and nice, salacious information. What sells newspaper? Gossip, mudslinging, straight-up lies, tiny half-truths, or innuendos wrapped in partial truth. Those things sell. Now, just look at today, social media. What sells? The same things. You know, it's been said, truth takes the bus, but salacious tidbits ride the express train. Now, the Federalist newspapers ramped up their attacks, and initially they started focusing on Representative Mathew Lyons. He's a Vermont representative. He was a Democrat Republican in a primary Federalist state. He was over in the western area over the Green Mountain. I think they called them the Green Mountain Boys. From the Federalists from Vermont, used a editor of the, get this name, Porcupine Gazette, and they dredged up as much dirt as they could find on him. So it was backstabbing galore. Each faction through its partisan newspapers and published pamphlets. Now, this guy, Benjamin Franklin Bach, well, he's named after his grandfather. Benjamin Franklin Bach, he was the editor of the Aurora. He was the grandson of Benjamin Franklin. He was the most controversial newspaper, or he edited the most controversial newspaper in America. He was fearless. This guy attacked Washington, Adams, and he actually talked bad about and put down Adams and the debacle known as the XYZ affair. Now, Benjamin Franklin Bach might have been the most controversial journalist in America, but he was not the most despised. That distinction belongs to James Thompson Callender. Now, matter of fact, Abigail Adams, she was the wife of President Adams, she considered him a viper let loose on society. And guess what? His first target? A piece-by-piece detail. And this is on page 204 of his 312-page tome, The History of the United States for 1796. And guess who this target was? Alexander Hamilton. And what was it about? His extramarital affair with the married Maria Reynolds. So without going into gamesmanship, this paper said this and this paper said that, the Federalists had had enough, and they struck. They started to arrest people, and they started with Bach for common law libel. And they hoped he'd put him away and bankrupt his paper, the Aurora. But you know what? That wasn't satisfactory. So what the Federalists proposed and actually passed, at least in this part relating to this subject, was the Sedition Act. And they made it basically illegal to speak against both houses of Congress, the president, which were both Federalists, but get this, not the vice president, who Jefferson at that time was the vice president and a Democrat Republican. Now, if that's not partisan, I don't know what is. But anyway, the act sunset on March 3rd, 1801. Guess what that coincided with? The next presidential inauguration, because that's when the date of inauguration was at that time was March 3rd. Now's the time to stop and ask yourself, does any of this kind of battling in social media and passing of rules and regulations and conduct that kind of seems partisan, how they go after one person and don't go after another, does that sound familiar? We see it happening today. It doesn't matter whether you like somebody or don't like somebody or you don't like the way they talk or act. If the laws or the conduct of one when they're in power is to go after the other that's not in power, to destroy them, how's that really different than what was happening in France? Granted, there's no guillotine, but the vitriol and the language and the things that are going on in social media today, they're destroying people right and left, jailing them right and left. That's exactly what they did in the 1790s. We're going to see that right now. So the Federalists went after a bunch of them. They went after Bach, and despite his looming court case, he still worked in his paper, and he asserted that he was going to do everything he could against this new quote-unquote gag law. He fought the Federalists through the Aurora, attacking Alexander Hamilton's affair. They went after Mathew Lyons, and Mathew Lyons was actually found guilty by a Federalist judge, by a Federalist jury, and sent to prison. He was a Vermont representative at the time, and guess what? He was reelected while he was in prison, and he went back to Congress again. They came after Callender. Callender ran to Virginia, out of the reach of the people in Philadelphia, and he was discreetly supported by Jefferson. He gave him periodic checks, and he let him use his library in his home. He was finally arrested, found guilty. Again, Federalist juries, Federalist judge of sedition. How many Federalists were put in jail? None. None that I could find. Just the Democrat Republicans. Does that sound familiar? Now, if that's not a two-tiered system, I don't know what is. Don't we see that happening? No matter what side of the fence you're on, when the laws don't apply to all, they don't apply to anyone. And in this case, the law only applied in this case to Democrat Republicans who were speaking badly against government and government officials. And why was that such a big deal to them? Because they believed that you had a right to speak so long as that wasn't tearing down the government. And tearing down the government and making it look weak in the eyes of the people or the world was, in their mind, sedition and worthy of being arrested, put in jail, and fined and shut you down because you had a right to speak, but not against the government. So the law sunset. Jefferson was elected president, and we had seen in a couple of episodes about how contentious that was. And Callender exited prison. He went to his benefactor looking for some payback for all the hard work he had provided for Jefferson on the sly. And Jefferson basically sidelined him, ignored him as if it didn't happen, didn't talk to him because he couldn't. Then he would be showing that he actually was party to what Callender had done. So what did Callender do? Callender spent the rest of his time going after Jefferson. And how did that work out for him? Well, he did publish a piece about Jefferson and Sally Heming. And as we saw in the beginning, the truth of that statement wouldn't see the light of day until 1998. And as Thomas Jefferson reached his zenith in the eyes of the people in the Louisiana Purchase, Mr. Callender spiraled downward to his demise in the James River. But it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Callender ends up face down in the James River. Thomas Jefferson and Louisiana Purchase. Not saying, but for sure, one of them at the time won't be telling any tales. You can have a passion for liberty and individual rights, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to hate people or hate the government. It's about respecting the government enough to protect it from the ambitious souls that year after year migrate to the Capitol to quote unquote run it for us. Every time they find a new crisis, a fresh opportunity to regulate and control, to be mindful. Most of the concerns that really kind of inflame us, and eventually down the road, they will just kind of fade away into historical footnotes, like the XYZ affair and some of the other things we've talked about in previous episodes. What remains is the measure that a generation, not its policies, what it enacts to deal with the difficulties. It's not the putting down voices you don't like to hear. The true measure of greatness, what we see from and learn from the 1790s and what's going on today, is the degree of wisdom showed in looking beyond what's going on today, right now, and passing that liberty unfettered to the next generation. I'll leave a light on for you. Well, we filled those pages. If you have comments, suggestions, share them. The more input, the more likely a better outcome. I'm moving forward because backwards is not an option. I've turned the lights on here, and I'll be leaving them that way. Join me next time on The Red Pill Diary.